I'm Aunt Corlett. I just finished a project, which I like to call a quest, called Easel on down the road. Somebody who's also a friend but was reading my blog saw that I didn't have a name for it. I was calling it Reckless Road Tripping, and that didn't fit really. Easel on down the road was named by Jillian Mead, actually, and it just stuck. So I hit a new period in my life where I was single. My youngest went to college. I worked in a gallery, and so I had big spaces of time in the winter where I could do something else. And so I decided to drive and visit my son in Texas. He had just moved there. And so I threw my paints in the car and I was like, you know what? I need a project. I'm just going to paint a landscape in every state. And that's how it started. I have an intimate relationship with every single state. Someone says Iowa, I know exactly where I was. I remember driving there. I remember painting there. Someone says even New Jersey, which I didn't even spend a night in. I only spent a day in. I have a very clear relationship with New Jersey. Ooh, this is a good one. Okay, this is a good story. Okay, so this is New Hampshire. The night before, I went to dinner at a bar, like a pub, and got a burger and sat at the bar, and it was a Sunday night. The guy next to me, I said, where should I paint? And he said, oh, I got the perfect place. It's a rest stop, and it has the perfect view of the Presidential Range, which are part of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And I was in North Conway, okay? So that just was because that was between Maine and home. Later that month, I was visiting my daughter. She was going to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I had some time to kill, so I went to the Ann Arbor Art Museum, which is part of the University of Michigan Art Museum. And I was walking through, and I saw this painting of mountains, and I stopped, and it was old, and I stopped to read about it. And it was painted in the 1860s, and it was painted in North Conway, New Hampshire. And I looked, and it is the exact same view. The exact same view. It made my skin crawl because this painting was 150 years old, or 100 and whatever. And all of a sudden, I saw myself as part of a long line of artists, like a continuing line of artists throughout history, recording the same mountains. And I looked, and the reason I told you about the shapes is that I knew those shapes. I'm like, they haven't changed. Some mountains don't change, I think that as far as, like life lessons that I maybe learned from this is how important people are. By the third year, I was really low on funding. So I decided to try crowdfunding. But I was just amazed how many people. I think I had over 60 people. I made over $12,000. And that was enough so that I could spend a month going to the Southwest and a month going to the Northwest and not stay in like the lowest of the stickiest little motel. The further away I get from the project, the more life lessons sort of bubble to the surface. And one thing is that painting, to be a painter and to do painting, actually takes a lot of courage, because you're putting your guts out for the rest of the world. Also, there's no structure, so you have to invent the project, and then the problem, and then solve the problem. And there is no right answer, which is good, but it just takes a lot of courage to keep doing that day after day, keep doing something that doesn't have a right answer. So I learned I could do it in any landscape. And by the way, painting in a landscape that isn't my familiar landscape is extra scary. So I'm used to painting in the dunes, the sand dunes, the water, the sky. I also love trees. I go to the dunes, Saugatuck Dune State Park quite a bit, and paint trees or have trees in the foreground and stuff. When you paint that enough, and I have painted a lot, both in paint and pastel, watercolor, you develop a language, and it's a language of shapes, it's a language of color. You start to understand what you're looking at, or your environment. You start to understand it in a non-verbal way. And you use those shapes and those colors to express how you feel. So you go to a landscape that you have never been to before, and let's say it's like, well, the Badlands. What could be more different? You might as well be on Mars. It's just a nutty, crazy, weird landscape. And so you stand there and you think, how am I going to make sense of this? I can't use the language I know from Michigan. I can't use the shapes and the colors because they're not here. I don't know how to paint rocks. You know, so every painting, you know, the Badlands is a really good example because it's so different, but really every painting was out of my environment was a huge challenge. Also, you can't care. You can't care about the end product. So if you learn not to care, then you understand that you're there because you love to paint. So life lessons. So I bring this back in the studio. I'm not here to make a product. I'm here to paint because I love painting. So the end product is a perk, hopefully. Sometimes you have to throw them out or paint over them. But it's just an end product. It's not why I do it. And I think to have true authenticity as a painter, which is a big, difficult, scary thing, like you want to do something that's really original, to have that, you need to, at least for me, do it for the sake of painting. You can come much closer to authenticity as a person and as a painter if you're all about the process rather than the end product. It's true in life too. So it's so weird how painting is a mirror for real life. If you're just about how you travel through life rather than where you're going to go, it's just a much more authentic way to experience life. The exhibit is grouped in trips. The first trip was called Reckless Road Tripping. Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. It was a great trip. I worked on all small and translated them to large later. The second trip is Mom Tour. And I did a lot of watercolors, and I came home and painted this from one of them. That's Florida. The third trip was with a good friend who's also a painter, and therefore it is called the Tandem Adventure. Virginia and West Virginia. I painted in many places in Virginia, and I do have a lot of small canvases. This is the one big one. It was a farm with cows. And it was a lovely place to paint. West Virginia, it was hard to find a place. We finally found an overlook, looking over, I think those are the Smoky Mountains. Might be the Blue Ridge Parkway. Of course, I don't really know. I have learned a lot about geography. This is the fourth trip. I did 5 states. I call it the Badlands Easel because the Badlands was smack in the middle of it. First, Wisconsin, I stayed with a friend and painted on their farm. Minnesota, North Shore of Lake Superior, amazing place. People were rappelling off these rocks while I was painting. It was really cool. You can see it was windy, cold. I had polar fleece on. Okay, then by the time I drove across to North Dakota, it was boiling hot. I went to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, that's North Dakota. South Dakota's in the Badlands. The Badlands National Park is amazing. If you haven't gone, you better go. Way home was Iowa. I just pulled up at a roadside park and set up my stuff one afternoon. It was a beautiful day. I loved painting there. Being from Michigan, I have painted lots of farms, and I felt really at home painting in Iowa after painting such a difficult place as the Badlands. That was all in one year. This is still the first year, 2013. I went to Tennessee and stayed with my niece, and this is in the city of Nashville, this giant park, which I can't remember the name of. Then I went to Kentucky and stayed in a state park. And then I went to Indiana and stayed with a friend on her farm, and that's a painting of her farm. Now, that's the end of 2013, my first year. It's 16 paintings.
in 2013. The beginning of 2014, I decided to go to Florida and visit my mom. I had already painted in Florida, but I drove and I went first to Alabama. It was cold, but I love that painting. I visited my mom in Florida, and then I came up and went to Georgia. I did invent the foliage because it was January, or maybe February, but it was cold. Then I went to South Carolina, stayed in a beautiful state park, and then I painted the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina, just outside of Asheville. Okay, this is the second trip of 2014. I went to the East Coast. I stayed with my niece in DC. On the way, I painted in Pennsylvania. I actually stayed with a college roommate. That was great. This is Maryland, and I painted outside of Annapolis at my niece's friends. So I had a private beach. That was very nice. In Delaware, I was in a state park. It was pouring rain, so I did watercolors from my car and came home and painted this oil painting of Delaware. Then I went to New Jersey and found another state park. Most of my paintings are actually from state parks, about a third of them. And that is New Jersey. It's called Fort Mott State Park. And that was the end of that trip. Again, that's the beginning of 2014. In the fall of 2014, I went to New England. So all 6 states are here. I first painted in Connecticut. This was in the Thimble Islands. There were these teeny little islands, just 1 or 2 houses per island. And I took a boat taxi, which was only $5, and I was going to the furthermost island, which was the only public one. And on the way, an older gentleman who was going with his family to their island, and their island was called Bear Island, B-E-A-R. So anyway, that's Connecticut. Rhode Island, I found a state park. It's called Colt State Park because the gun manufacturer was of Colt. It used to be their private estate. So that's Rhode Island. Massachusetts, I went to a national wildlife refuge on the coast, of course, up north towards Maine, because I was meeting my boyfriend in Maine the next day. In Maine, I went to the furthermost point in the United States, which is Lubec, Maine, and this lighthouse is at Quoddy Head State Park, and that is a Canadian island, and that connects to a later painting. Okay, Maine. On the way home, New Hampshire. This is out of North Conway, and many artists, and I found a painting later of the same mountains, the Presidential Range. Many artists painted from this point and that exact view, which is very cool that I'm part of a long line of American landscape painters celebrating the American landscape. Vermont, last state of New England. I went under a bridge of a highway and painted this stream. And actually it was very nice. It was kind of raining. Michigan, my home state. I did this in the fall after New England. I went out to the Dune State Park where I take my dog quite a bit and painted this, and I loved working there because I do a lot of paintings in Michigan. So coming home and painting at home felt great. Next trip was later that same fall, so we're still in 2014, and I went to New York. This is near Ithaca, New York. At the bottom of the Finger Lakes, there's all these beautiful, gorgeous cliffs, and the Civilian Conservation Corps built walkways and bridges and stuff in the 1930s, and they're fabulous, and it was a really special place to paint. So that's New York State, and on my way home, I stayed in Cleveland and decided to paint a skyline. And it was a cold day, and it probably looks cold. It was end of October. In 2015, I did a Kickstarter to earn enough money to take 2 long trips to capture the rest of the states. 2013 and 2014, I did 16 states each time. 2015, I had to do 16 and then save the last one for the beginning of 2016. Anyway, this is New Mexico. I went to Ghost Ranch, which is where Georgia O'Keeffe spent much of her time painting in New Mexico. And actually, that's an iconic, it's called Chimney Rock, and she painted that many times. Arizona, Sedona, Arizona. That's called Bell Rock. Nevada came after Arizona. This is Lake Mead. I was actually painting from a rest stop, which was very convenient. Then I went to Utah. I stayed in a lovely place in Escalante. It's a beautiful area of the country, southern Utah. I want to go back and paint more. This is Colorado. I stayed near Telluride in a small town called Ridgway. I stayed in a horse ranch. It was through Airbnb. It was a lovely place to stay and to be and to paint. On the way home, I went through Kansas. This is Scott Lake State Park. It just was on my way home. It's kind of a fun painting anyway. Missouri, I asked the people at the hotel where I was staying where to paint, and they said Ha Ha Tonks State Park. So that's where I went. Next big trip I call the Northwest 7. This was a year ago now. It was June of 2015. A whole month I was gone. My boyfriend and I drove out to Montana, and then he flew home, and I did the rest of the trip on my own with my 10-pound dog, Charlie. This is Montana. That's actually Glacier National Park in the background, and this is Flathead Lake. Idaho, beautiful place to paint. It was scorching hot, and I found shade by this fabulous river, and I had a really nice day of painting in Idaho. This is Washington. I was staying with my cousin, and they had a place on Orcas Island, and so I painted, and I was looking at the Canadian islands, and so that relates to Maine, where I stayed with a cousin and painted a different cousin looking at a Canadian island. Anyway, I think that's kind of a nice bookend. This is Oregon. Obviously, I'm on the coast looking south near the Sea Lion Caves, and I found a beautiful spot. It turned out to be private property, but they said, please stay. I couldn't tell, and I pulled over and started painting. California, it was a crazy hot day, and there were deer flies buzzing my head, and one landed in the wet painting. It was a difficult place to paint. This is Shasta National Forest in the northern part of California. It was beautiful, but it was quite a difficult experience. I do like the painting anyway. Wyoming was my reward for difficult California because I found Mirror Lake, and it's in the Medicine Bow National Forest, which is on the southern part of Wyoming, and it's part of the Rockies that spill over from Colorado. It was an exquisite place, 12,000-foot peaks. The snow was still on them, and it was 90 degrees. It was beautiful. Nebraska, on my way home, I was in a city park, actually, that was huge, used to be a cornfield, and I found a farm, and I just thought, farms, Nebraska, big sky. I love that sky. Then I went to Alaska for about 10 days, stayed near Homer. This is looking down a hill. Homer is around this curve, and these are peaks of volcanoes that are coming through the clouds. Cook Inlet is over to your right, and so you're kind of looking southwest here. Alaska was an amazing place, stunning. I put Illinois off. I think it was so close and so easy, and I found, well, not easy, but I mean, I had a lot of friends, and this is from the art studio of one of my friends who's a sculptor, and obviously it's the Chicago skyline, and I actually used to live really close in Pilsen when I lived in Chicago in an artist neighborhood, so it felt really good, like going home. My very last trip was to Hawaii. It was my reward for 3 years of hard work. This is the only painting done in 2016. My boyfriend and I flew there end of January, stayed about 14 days. This is on the small island of Kauai, and which was just an amazing place to be. And strangely like Alaska, I think because of the volcanoes and the rock formations everywhere just rising out of the ocean. So that's all 50. And that's all I have to say.